Welcome to Brain the Vat. We are delighted to be joined by Jess Flanigan, and we're going to be talking about taxation. Jess, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
So imagine that you have a job where you provide some kind of services to somebody. So you're like a barista, or you work in retail, or you're a professor, whatever your job is. And for 4 days a week, you're just working for yourself. And so you provide some kind of service, and then you get money for it, and then you can just spend that money however you want. But for one day of the work week, every Wednesday, 100% of your labor is fully conscripted, and you don't get to keep any of the gains for your labor. So you've been fully conscripted into some other kind of collective project where you're not working for yourself on that day. On Wednesday, all of your labor is going to somebody else. You would think, well, that's not fair, but that's actually how taxes work for most people. So if you work and you pay a 20% income tax, which is pretty low for most places, but just be very generous towards the tax system. That means that if you work 5 days a week, one of those days you're fully working for someone else. And you might think, well, who am I working for? Is it a good cause? How are they spending it? And what if I told you that most of what you're working for is just going to be healthcare that doesn't necessarily make people better off, cash transfers to old people who don't want to work anymore, or a very large and wasteful national defense program. And that's where it's going. And so if you're a person who is just a working person paying taxes, one day of the week, every week that you show up to work, you're just providing money to fund ineffective programs or to provide cash transfers to elderly people. And that's like most of what you're doing that day. You're not working for yourself, you're working for those other programs.
So in South Africa, which is where Mark and I are located, we have much higher taxes than 20%. We have a progressive tax system, and at the top tiers, if you're earning in the top tax bracket of income, you'll be paying 45% in taxes. So it's not one day of the week that you'll be giving your money away. It's almost half of your days, which is quite terrifying. And so we're very sympathetic to your position. But the question is, suppose your money wasn't being given away to a poor cause, but to a good cause. So in other words, your money wasn't being taken and spent in a frivolous way or towards bad ends, but towards good ends. Then would it be justified to take your money?
So you can imagine that there might be some kinds of things that people call non excludable public goods, where the only way to get this really, really, really beneficial thing off the ground would be to require that everybody contribute. Because if you didn't coercively require that everybody contribute to it, everybody would have an incentive to free ride, and it would be an under provision of something really important. So people cite examples like national defense, or the rule of law and public safety, or clean air as the kinds of things that are non excludable public goods that maybe there's some justification for taxing people for the sake of those things. But even if you think that, it doesn't follow that the way you should tax people should be an income tax. Because the way that an income tax works is that it taxes a person's labor, where you're not really giving them control over their occupational choices or the choices about their own body. Instead, I think a better way to finance taxation, tax funded programs, even for a really worthy cause, would be through taxes that are on the property system, or value added taxes, so like a land value tax or VAT or something like that, where the taxation is financed through the fees that you would collect through the enforcement of a property system in the first place. And in that way, you're not really taxing people who aren't liable to be taxed. You're like offering a service, which is like upholding the rule of law, upholding a property system. And it can be this more like fee for service model of how taxes might work. You might still have to have some kind of coercion in any state based society. That would be a requirement. That's the thing that separates the statist from the anarchist. But um, even the best case scenario where there's a worthy cause, it wouldn't be an income tax. of how you would do it, I would think. And even then, those types of taxes should be a last resort, because if you could alternatively use, for example, kind of common pool resources selling into a market, that would be better. So like how Norway has a lot of natural resources and energy that they can use to finance social programs. I think that's a morally better system than coercing their own citizens.
So, one way of conceiving of a tax system is that it's good for everybody to contribute to this thing that will provide a wide benefit. And I suppose the question is whether taxes really do that. So, as you mentioned, quite minimalist things. So, like protecting the rule of law. So, I suppose setting up a dispute resolution process for civil disputes or for criminal matters. Um, I think people might take the view that you could have a social security style system. So, you might fall on hard times. You might get a disability. And so having public healthcare is a good idea. Maybe you have some other difficulty in your life and you're rendered homeless. So having public healthcare, public shelters would be good. And so the question about which goods is it okay to force people to contribute towards would be the one question. And so you can imagine a Rawlsian who says, well, behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know how you're going to be born. You might have the disability or, be homeless. So it's in your self-interest to have a system which has this, social safety net. Or you might take the view, well, I'm not behind the veil of ignorance. I know what my position is, and I want to act in my current rational self-interest. And I would much rather that these kinds of goods were provided by private actors. So if you're the kind of person who can't afford healthcare, well, maybe you should become the kind of person who can and get it provided efficiently, quickly, and well by the private sector. And that if you really are the kind of person who could never transform yourself into that person, well, then what you want to do is have a society which encourages donations and private provisions of charity. And that the difficulty with the state doing that is that it crowds out private actors from the marketplace.
I'm going to kind of sum up the general gist of it of like, well, what about the case for having a more egalitarian distribution, on the thought that a more egalitarian distribution financed through a progressive tax system would be more justifiable to everybody that had to live under it. That's the kind of Rawlsian idea. And there's just a brutal trade-off if we think about the economy between the size of the pie, so how much productivity is there in the total economy, how many resources are there up for distribution, how efficiently can we deliver these resources to people, how much innovation is there, how much new stuff, so the kind of big pie pro-market view, and then the internal distribution of the pie. And the more equal you make the pie, the less pie there is, the smaller the pie is. That's because most taxes distort economic decision making in a way that discourages people from productive behavior. And so an income tax is a detriment to people using their labor productively. And so what do I mean by using their labor productively? The thing that a market solves for is a scarcity of having an interest to help another person on your own, like a lack of charity. And the thing that a market does that's really great is it solves for that problem by linking up my own self-interest into your self-interest. So if like you can offer me money, then I have like much more of an incentive to want to help you in some way. And so markets themselves, having a market economy, is enormously helpful for everybody, because when you see those productive exchanges that are mutually beneficial, that's a sign that there's a lot of helping that's going on through the market exchange. And that's what like a productive market-based society is. Now, of course, there's a downside of that, which is what everybody brings up, which is that those types of societies, highly productive market societies, also tend to be very, very unequal. Because the more efficient you are, the more you're going to learn how to deliver beneficial services that a lot of people value at scale to a large number of people. And then very rich people can capture enormous gains from being in a very big, highly productive market society. And you got a lot of inequality there. And the way that you reduce that inequality would be by restricting those people, those highly productive people who are providing large scale benefits to a lot of people in an efficient way. You tell them, you know what, we're going to put a cap on how much you can gain from engaging in that kind of productive behavior. And that's going to shrink the size of the pie. And so if you want more equality, there's just a trade-off between equality and productivity. My view is, if we look at the last 500 years of human history, the number one thing that has brought us out of poverty, brought human rights, reduced infant mortality, promoted overall well-being for everybody, has been the evolution of markets and permitting industrialization, transitioning to the service economy, even though that's also led to a great deal of domestic inequality and global inequality. But that's still the best technology that we've discovered as a species for improving human well-being. And so I would be very reluctant to ever want to mess with that technology for the sake of equality, because I think it's just going to ultimately make everybody worse off in the long run.
Playing devil's advocate here for a moment, and I really do think it is playing the role of the devil in this argument. The far left communist says, well, I'm prepared to sacrifice the size of the pie for equality. So who is it that benefits from this larger pie? They'd say it's the 1%, it's the people right at the top, it's not the majority at the bottom. And so fine, if we have to reduce the size of the pie overall, at least the people at the bottom will get more than they're getting now. Who cares if the pie is bigger if most people can't benefit from it?
I don't think that's true that the people at the bottom will get more than they're getting now. I think that's the mistake that the more communist perspective makes. I think that if you look at the most productive, large society in the world, it's the United States. And the worst off people in the United States, who are in some ways very badly off, are still far better off than people in that same quartile or quintile of the distribution in Europe, which has like more egalitarian political ideals in a lot of ways. For example, they have access to lower priced consumer goods. They have, much more choice over their own occupation in these ways because they have more economic freedom. They're not shut out of the labor market in the way that more regulated labor market, like European labor markets, will shut them out, leaving them into gray market economies or unemployment, which is very bad for people. So I don't think that the reason that people who are badly off have poor health outcomes is because they lack health insurance. I don't think that's doing it. So even for the worst off, being in a highly productive society that gives you things like Amazon and Netflix and Walmart and all sorts of access to consumer goods and also access to labor market opportunities that you wouldn't otherwise have in a more regulated economy, it's better even for them. And so if you're a Marxist, I think you should focus on the material conditions of the worse off, the material conditions of the working class, not the symbolic aspects of it. And if we're just looking at the material conditions of the working class, being in a market economy is better for them. Now, Marx was right about capitalism in an important way that I think people who are more libertarian often overlook, which is that labor within a capitalist economy is extremely alienating. And the reason that it's alienating is because it is so helpful to people that you don't know. So I'm a mother, I have 4 children, I do a lot of labor for my children because I love them and it's free and it's not alienating at all. Because internal to my own values and reasons, I want to help them. And I'm like so locked in on that labor. It's just like so close to my own psychology and so rewarding to me. And then I have a job. And my job, I do a lot of stuff where it's kind of unclear why I'm even doing it. Like I'm like filling out expense reports or like filing my travel reimbursement. It's just like I'm a cog in this very like efficient system. And even then, my actual job, it's not that alienating compared to a lot of jobs because it's still pretty close to like my own interest and values. But now imagine that I'm like a person who takes tags off of clothing items and then puts new tags on, a reprocessing person in like a factory for like a garment factory, taking imports and reprocessing from the tags. I have like no interest in doing that, but for the money. And I'm extremely alienated from whatever benefit I'm providing people, which is basically protecting brands' intellectual property and reprocessing things so they can be sold at like TJ Maxx or whatever. And that is alienating. Like that's true. And the reason it's alienating is because it's so efficient to be doing that. You're providing this like very, very, very small benefit to a large, large number of people, but you're not really seeing any of those people, and the benefit is really too small for anybody to concretely perceive. And so Marx was right. Like it's very alienating, but the reason it's alienating is because that's what it is to be participating in an economy where you're able to help a bunch of strangers that like you don't even know. Like the beautiful thing about markets is the thing that makes it difficult for the worker.
So you alluded earlier to the idea that we might want to have different kinds of taxes besides personal income tax because it punishes labor. And you gave an argument in favor of, let's say, property taxes, but that seems to punish property owners. And part of what you wanted to get at was this idea of really it's a user pays system. So you could imagine abolishing taxes and rather having a voluntary project where you say, here are the goods that the state can provide you. Um, if you contribute to them, then you will have access to them. So you might think, well, maybe there's a possibility that I will be falsely accused of a crime, and that I would need to have a justice system that works. So I'm willing to, put some money into the system as an insurance benefit. But you can imagine someone who says, well, I'm not willing to contribute to that. And so if they are charged with the crime, um, well, then you might think that they don't get access to that public good of the judicial system. Could be dealt with extrajudicially. That might be one option that you could have. Um, One of the objections to sort of doing away with taxes is this idea that you would then dismantle the state. Is that a really terrible thing to imagine? Could we imagine many of the functions of the state being dealt with in other ways? So, for example, in South Africa, it's made the news recently that if you want to get a civil trial heard, in other words, a dispute between two parties, it will take you 7 years. But you can go and hire an arbitrator and have that dispute resolved between you. And that could be done very rapidly. And so what we've found is that as the state fails in South Africa, the private sector, rushes to the rescue. So we have many more private security officers than we do members of the police or members of the military, because private security works very well. We have private toll roads that are beautiful to drive on, as opposed to the ones provided by the state that are covered in potholes. So there's a sense in which, as the South African state withers, the private sector flourishes. And so one argument would be, well, let's just hasten that process by depriving it of its money.
Um, I do think that in general, privatizing state functions is a good idea. And part of the reason is that there's more accountability within a privatized system because the state claims a monopoly. They don't have competition. And so even if the privatized system is in some ways being funded by the state, like private prisons, for example, at least then if you see like very serious abuses or kinds of mistreatment, there's some other competitor that can come and offer a superior service to the one private provider and outcompete them. Whereas if everything's fully public, there's not a lot of incentive for public institutions to reform, but for electoral incentives. And electoral incentives aren't necessarily always going to be in the public interest, especially because of just institutional quirks about how voting systems work. A lot of times those electoral incentives will, benefit smaller stakeholders or reflect a kind of ideological position because when people vote they don't really bear the price of what they're supporting or voting for in the same way that consumers bear the price of what they paid for, and so voters are much less constrained. And so I do think there's a presumptive reason to favor privatization in all of these contexts. And then you say like, and wouldn't it be better if the state were to just wither away and we had an anarchist society? And I think that's right, and I think everybody kind of agrees with that. And so if everybody were morally perfect and we had great information about stuff and we were all well motivated, that would be the best. That's the best case scenario. So even Jerry Cohen, famous socialist philosopher, was like, yeah, the best society would be an anarchist socialist society where everybody had an egalitarian ethos and they were like well disposed to cooperate on egalitarian terms without having any coercive pressure for them to do so. And libertarian anarchists are like, no, the best society would be one where everybody voluntarily helps the poor, and we don't have to have any state coercion. Everything can be done through private charity. Sure. And then so we can say oh, the best society is one where we have a good ethos, and also we don't have to coerce each other. There's no hierarchy or domination between people. There's no hierarchy or domination between the state and citizens. Now, here we are in the actual world, and there's a question of what direction should we move in? And similarly, we should move in that direction, but it doesn't follow that we should really try to live in a stateless way right now, given where we are, because there's just so many lower hanging fruit, so many easier gains on the table to just move towards increasing privatization. And I don't know that it would be effective to fully abandon the state given where we currently are. So it's when people say oh, I'm an anarchist and that would be the best society. If you're speaking in ideal theory, then yeah, I agree. I think a lot of people would agree that a stateless society would be morally better. And then if you're talking in non-ideal theory, I think the guidance that gives you isn't necessarily to try to bring about a stateless society. I think that the guidance it gives you is to try to slowly minimize the state. Why not bring about a stateless society? Part of the reason is because the reason the state is bad is because they enforce their will on people through violence. And the reason that people who try to bring about a stateless society often fail is because there is a lot of violence involved in not having a state.
So I want to talk about a different type of tax that has become very topical recently. You mentioned personal income tax, VAT, property tax. I'm curious about a different type of tax that doesn't necessarily target civilians directly. Instead, it targets other countries, and that's tariffs. So the idea is basically that if you're unhappy as a country with your relationship with another country, or if you're unhappy with the values that they hold, you would place a tariff on that country's goods. Anyone from your own country who's purchasing goods from that country would have to pay a tariff, which will make it more difficult to buy those goods and discourage trade with that country. What are your views on tariffs? Because it sounds like they might avoid some of your arguments.
Yeah, I'm opposed to tariffs in the same way that I'm opposed to immigration restrictions, which is that both tariffs and immigration restrictions are nationalist policies that punish domestic citizens who want to trade with people in other countries, and also discriminate against people in other countries just on the basis of their nationality, even if they would have a lot to offer people here. So in the immigration case, I think that people in America, we really benefit from having a more competitive labor market and being open to all of the talent in the world. Similarly, I think Americans really benefit from having an open market in consumer goods and just being open to all of the productive innovations that everybody else in the world has to offer. And because public officials in my country have decided that they disapprove of public officials in another country, that means that my own ability to trade with people in other countries, my own freedom to make those decisions for myself in terms of purchasing is limited. And so they're not just limiting the rights of foreigners, they're limiting the rights of their own citizens to freely trade with other people. And then the cost of those tariffs are not borne by public officials, generally, in other countries. The costs are borne by producers in other countries and consumers here. And when the costs are borne by producers in other countries, that means that there's an impediment to economic development. And as I said earlier, economic development is one of the best technologies for just improving human rights, public health, overall well-being for everybody in the world. And people in other countries, developing countries, especially in manufacturing sectors that are still at that phase of their industrial development, really, really, really need access to opportunities to be able to manufacture stuff for people outside of their own country. And so it's really hurting those workers. And then people in our country would really benefit from the opportunity to have lower cost consumer goods, lower cost cars, refrigerators, clothes, whatever. And we also bear those costs. Meanwhile, malevolent state actors in other countries who see that these tariffs are being imposed just reciprocate with tariffs on, likewise. And it doesn't really achieve any of the kind of sanctioning benefits or effects. If anything, it can make people dig in and then be less likely to want to cooperate with us because we have fewer cooperative trade relations going forward. So I think tariffs are both a restriction on people's freedom and also generally counterproductive. It's just expressive.
So I want to give two arguments in favor of tariffs. The one is that it may very well be the case that having a totally free market is good for Americans and good for everyone else, but not in the same way. So it seems to be the case that if you were the steel worker in Ohio, that NAFTA was bad for you, that your industry shriveled up, the Mexicans, the Canadians could do a much better job. And so while it's true that GDP went up and overall Americans did better, you didn't. And so you might think that the role of the state is partly to protect its citizens, and we talk about these as protectionist policies, and it might take the view that there are certain things worth protecting, um, and that those people have a legitimate complaint or will get some kind of benefit through the tariffs. The second is that you can imagine a state that engages in really immoral practices and would be deterred through tariffs and would change its conduct. So you can imagine, for example, that you've got a state that produces its goods through slave labor. Maybe even it's got an even more prejudiced view on it, so it goes and enslaves an ethnic minority group and gets them to produce the goods. And you say to that state, provided that you keep doing this practice, we're going to tariff your goods. And they say, well, we make a lot of money from selling our goods. It would be in our economic interests to change our practices, and so the tariff then has that function. So, assuming it does have the deterrence effect, and assuming we can benefit certain vulnerable national citizens, are those good reasons for keeping the tariffs in place or for using them as a tool?
Yeah, so the first set of reasons, which is the American steelworker doing worse off because he can't compete with a Mexican automaker, I don't think that's a good reason. And part of the reason that I think you see that happening is because what's happened in a lot of highly productive economies is that they start shifting from manufacturing skills being highly valuable into like knowledge work or service industry jobs as they become more productive. And that shift, that economic transition, it is hard on some of the people who are going to be left behind. But those people are not entitled to hold up the rest of the economy just so that they can maintain a union job and like finish out their career as a steelworker or whatever. Because that what they would be then saying is that they're going to pass the costs onto all other consumers, which is going to be extremely costly to everybody else in society that would have to, for example, pay more for a car or pay more for, you know, manufactured goods made in America. When also the made in America workers are comparatively better off than the foreign workers who would be benefiting much more from having access to those jobs. If you want to address the plight of people who are put out of work because of industrialization moving out of that phase of our economy into more knowledge work or service worker type sectors, just address their material needs rather than holding up the rest of the economy in order to give them a sense of meaning. It's sort of condescending to be like, it's like when you let your children cook, even though they're like not actually that helpful because like they just want to feel like they're a part of something, but then like the meal takes forever and it's like not as good for everybody else in the family because it was like made partly by a 6 year old. And it's like, I don't think that American steelworkers would like it if that was how people viewed what they were doing. But that is what they're basically asking for. They're saying, even though I'm by hypothesis less productive than foreign workers in virtue of the wage that I demand and the way that I'm making, the way that I'm operating in this more regulated labor environment, even though I'm less productive, I still want to be the person to do it just because I want to feel like I'm a part of things, just for these expressive reasons. And it's like, I just think um, that sense of entitlement that they have is like very offensive to me. They think that they're entitled to hold up, access to more efficiently produced consumer goods for all of their compatriots just in virtue of the fact that they want to be able to work at the Chevy plant or whatever. Now the other question was like, well, what about like the really bad stuff, like a country that has slave labor and they're really doing badly. I mean, the slave labor stuff that's a serious human rights violation. Um, and I do understand the reasons that people would say, like, oh, we want to boycott that, have a consumer boycott, um, or maybe like we're not going to buy things that were made through this unjust labor. Even in those cases, though, I'm a little bit skeptical that trying to deter economic development in those places is going to be instrumentally the best move. Because in places where we see those types of violations, I think there's a lot of political corruption, a lack of accountability, a lack of empowerment. Women and children are really mistreated in a lot of those places. And the way for people to have more political freedom is really, I do think economic development. I think that just having more money kicking around in that economy and having people have more productivity coming out of that economy is going to be, in the long run, generally better. And so I understand people's hesitancy. And I think it's great if consumers do want to boycott places that they think are like genuinely enslaving people. I also do think that, with the exception of some cases of prison labor, what people are calling slave labor, that kind of rhetoric, we should be very careful about, because some stuff that people perceive as being forced labor or non-voluntary labor, I don't think that that perception's warranted. I think that it's working conditions that are very different from our own, but those working conditions are a reflection of the general productivity of the population and the comparative advantage that the company has in production. But people are free to leave, and people freely take those jobs. And so, as long as people are free to leave and they freely take the job, we should infer from the fact that people who freely took a job, that they were able to leave, that they are consenting to the terms and conditions of their labor, even if it looks really bad to us. So the only case I would ever want to use the term slave labor would be cases where people are genuinely have no recourse and are not free to leave. And I think that's fairly unusual in the global economy.
I want to push the defense of tariffs a little further. So, one of the reasons why you might want a tariff with, for example, China is because the Chinese government has historically subsidized some of its businesses. So, if it was not subsidizing its businesses, then you can imagine the case for not having tariffs, because you've got sort of an equal ground competition between American companies and Chinese companies. So you've got American companies and Chinese companies competing to produce the same good. And then, it's every man for himself and good luck to the winner. But if the Chinese government is subsidizing those foreign companies, then it's it's impossible for those American companies to produce the goods at the same rate. And, if the subsidy is large enough, it would be impossible. And then you might think, well, we're being crowded out the market through an artificial market manipulation point here. The Chinese government is changing the playing field, so it's no longer level. So we have to level the playing field, and so we put on a tariff. Why is that a bad argument?
That argument would only make sense if you thought that the thing that the prices were reflecting, or the things that markets were reflecting, was some kind of desert or merit at being able to efficiently produce goods better than your competitors, and that then you were entitled to that market if you were producing it just as efficiently, maybe more efficiently, or making a better good or something. But I think that kind of moralized view of the market is a mistaken way to think about it. Instead, you should just think, there are some producers that are able to produce product at a price that's lower than alternatives. And so I, as a consumer, benefit from the lower price, and I have an interest in being able to trade with them. And I don't care whether or not that producer has an advantage because his dad was really rich and was able to like fund him through the seed rounds, or his government is like putting in subsidies for it. I think it's a mistake for China to be doing that, because probably that's not producing like the most innovative and efficient production practices, but maybe, I don't know. I truly don't care as a consumer how it's getting to my door. The thing that I care about is that somebody's able to offer me something that I value in a way where I have to spend less of my grocery budget or less of my household budget buying it. That's like a huge win for me. And so, from my perspective as a consumer, I don't care if it came from one place or another. And if anything, it's like, in a lot of countries, if they're undercutting American producers just because they're saving on labor, like I think those people who are making it probably need the jobs more anyhow. And so kind of a win-win. So when US companies say, oh, we can't compete with China because the Chinese government is putting a thumb on the scales in favor of Chinese producers, I don't think that's a moral fact. I just think that's a descriptive fact. That's like saying, we here in, I mean, you guys are in South Africa, so the geography will be different. But like we here in, let's say, Canada, have a harder time farming because those people down in Central America have much better weather. They have much better conditions for producing things that people in the American market want. And so like that's not fair. And it's like, yeah, like it doesn't have to be fair. The whole point about the market is like that you're finding a way to distribute goods to the people who have an interest in buying it at a price where, you know, they think that that's their best option. And that's the way that you deliver the value to the consumer. In the long run, I think it's a mistake for China to be heavily subsidizing industry in the way that it is. Um, but it's a mistake for them. Like it's bad for them that they're doing it. It's not bad for us that they're doing it. We benefit.
So, one objection to taxation is that your tax money might be spent on really pernicious things. So, if I think about apartheid South Africa, a lot of tax revenue was spent in forcing racial segregation. And you might think that paying your money over to a state like that is participating in a sinister exercise, and that it's either permissible not to pay your taxes or it's obligatory not to pay your taxes. That the right thing to do there is to engage in some form of civil disobedience. Do you think that that would generally apply to states, or are these only special circumstances with particularly sinister ones?
I think it's probably permissible for people if they don't want to pay taxes to avoid it. I don't like because I just think that the state's just not entitled to it. And so I don't think that people who are subjected to tax law are liable to be coerced. I don't think it's required though. And I don't think that there's any special reason for you to express your civil disobedience in a way that's also conveniently giving you a 20% raise. And so I would be a little bit skeptical of a person who is a tax evader and they said, like, oh, the thing that I'm doing to really protest, like tax protesters, we have that in the United States where they say the thing I'm doing to protest the US government is I'm going to be a tax protester and I'm going to keep my money. But they're not like giving their money to some other kind of effective cause. They're not like using that surplus income to advocate for like more just institutions. Oftentimes, people who are tax evaders are trying to be very secretive about it so that they can effectively keep their money without subjecting themselves to any kind of legal penalty. And so I'm a little bit skeptical of the tax evasion as civil disobedience argument or tax protesters thinking that that's the most effective form of civil disobedience. I kind of think of it as the same kind of grandstanding as people when they're like, oh, I'm an egalitarian, but I don't give any money to charity. I help the poor through my scholarship. And I'm like, oh, well, how convenient for you that like doing philosophy, like doing the thing that you want to do anyhow is like the way that you're like bringing about justice by your own life. It's like how convenient for people that like keeping your money and spending it at Target and going on vacation is the way that you're bringing about justice by your own life. Um, so I'm a little bit skeptical of the that tax evasion could ever be morally praiseworthy or required in those ways. But I don't think that you're required to pay it because I just don't think that the government has an entitlement to it in most cases.
So I want to return to public goods. And I think this is where a lot of people would disagree with you. So they would say, hold on a moment, let's talk about the mechanics of this. So we need to fund a particular public good, and you mentioned a few, like national defense and a judicial system. How exactly would that work? So there's three proposals that have sort of been floated in this discussion, not all by you, but some of them by Mark. So either you could do it in a privatized way, so there could be private companies that generate these goods, but everyone puts into the coffers of these private companies. Second method, you could be funding it through other taxes. So you could be funding it instead of through income tax, as you suggested, through, for example, property tax or VAT or some other tax. And the third method, which is a method Mark suggested, is voluntarily paying towards the service, and then you get access to the service. But if you don't, voluntarily pay, you don't get access to the service. But all three of these methods have problems. Okay, so if you're going to go down the route of privatization, well, in practice, some people argue, and again, I'm now playing devil's advocate here, some people argue that privatized goods land up being more expensive. Why? Because often when those goods were being produced by the state, they were being subsidized by the state. So, for example, people point out the cost of electricity or water in the UK. Some of that has become privatized and it's become more expensive. And that's a big problem for a lot of people who can't afford it. It makes their cost of living very high, and that's a big problem. If you go down the route of funding it through other taxes, there just might not be enough money that way. Of course, a tax is only as big or large as you make it. So you could make your property taxes as high as you want, and then you got your money. But above a certain point, you hit the Laffer curve, and people don't want to pay it. So, one argument is, well, the majority of the state's coffers comes from income tax. If you take that away, there just logistically won't be enough money coming from other tax sources. And then thirdly, if you fund things through voluntary efforts, well, there could be other issues there as well. Not enough people might contribute to certain types of causes. So, for example, some people think that researching rare diseases is very important, but very few people would contribute to those causes, and so there just wouldn't be enough money to perform that research. So people are going to argue, to sum this up, that yes, this idea is a good idea, but in reality, when we look at the logistics of it, there just isn't a mechanism that we could collect enough money in the right ways to fund the right public goods.
I mean, maybe at the limit, all of that has some merit to it, but look at where we are right now at the level of taxation and the amount of things that taxes are being spent on. And from where we are right now, there's so much upside in moving towards those three solutions that even if those three solutions wouldn't solve for 100% of the undersupplied public goods, I think that they would solve for a lot of them. I think that the best public good that governments can do is upholding the rule of law and enforcing property rules that maintain a market economy. And that's like the number one great thing that any public official could ever enforce. And but within that, that's fairly cheap. Like that's not an especially expensive ask. If you look at what most national budgets are being spent on, it's redistribution, managing benefits like education or healthcare. Those are not the kinds of things that are the public goods that would really justify having some kind of state intervention. Your worry about privatization was that it would shift costs on to consumers more because private actors wouldn't enjoy state subsidies. But notice that the government's getting the money from somewhere too. And so the different consumers are spending it at a different point. And so, privatization might shift cost on the consumers, but sometimes that might be justifiable. For example, if it's shifting costs onto consumers that are actually using more of a good, instead of having a blanket tax on a bunch of consumers to provide a specialized good to a minority of them, where everybody's collectively bearing the cost of a good that they don't participate in and they don't benefit from. If you look at, so art museums, for example, if you look at the land value tax or, using gains from natural resource extraction, those types of arguments, they're less coercive than an income tax, I think. And those tax structures are better because they're not distorting the market, they're not distorting economic decision making in this way. And so, yeah, like where we are right now, having something like a land value tax would be better and more efficient than, I mean, maybe it's not perfect, maybe it's not gonna 100%, protect people from any kind of coercion, but it's definitely going to be better than the current system of taxing income, in terms of both efficiency and also in terms of freedom. And then the voluntary thing, you're right that like there's market failures and people don't always voluntarily contribute to things that are going to be collectively beneficial. But I think people will do it more than you think. And one reason that people aren't voluntarily contributing to things that are collectively beneficial often might be because the state is displacing them and preventing that. And so there are some communities, like religious communities, the Mormons in Utah is an example, where they have a kind of private welfare state for all members who voluntarily join in and participate. in that community of common concern, where they can kind of punish free riders by kicking them out, and it's a voluntarily community of support, or look at the way that people in the family have a kind of socialism within their families, and they voluntarily provide a lot of benefits for each other. We already know that many, many people are voluntarily laboring for the benefit of other people, even if they're not getting any kind of market return for it. But one reason that we don't see more of that might be that people now have a sense that this is the government's job. So where people used to take care of their family members into old age, elderly family members, now they don't, because now they say, oh, we have Social Security and subsidized retirement accounts. And so it would be a mistake to look at where we are right now and think that that's the level of capacity people have for voluntary labor on behalf of other people.
So I wonder if you're overly harsh on the tax evaders. So when they say I'm engaging in legitimate protest, you can imagine them doing two things. The one would be they say I'm going to spend the money effectively, either by donating to effective charities, or they do the thing that you think is really good, which is participate in the market economy. And so they say, I'm going to go on an overseas vacation. I'm going to take my family. I'm going to go buy a bunch of Vietnamese goods. Like, if we think that that conduct is efficient, is the way to prosperity, then it seems that instead of giving it to the wasteful state who's spending it on some pernicious things, that the better thing to have done was to have done the overseas travel, spoiled your family with a bunch of gifts, and empowered capitalism abroad.
Sure. I mean, I'm not going to say that that's like necessarily a mistake. I'm just saying that I'm not like handing out gold stars to people who just like coincidentally are doing something that's in their own interest, and then they can rig up some kind of high-minded story about why like they're the hero of society because they're protesting the injustices of their government. Like it might be that like it's both morally better for you to go on vacation and also that like, you know, that's the thing that you wanted to do anyhow. I'm just when I see people saying those types of things, I do wonder if like which one came first psychologically is the only question. And I don't know that tax evasion is the most efficient, effective way to make meaningful change in terms of either benefiting the global poor or protesting the government. Um, so that's but it might actually consequentially just be like better than the alternative, sure.
So, on the meaningful change front, it seems that there's a question here about your private actions. So, whether you pay your taxes or don't pay your taxes, for most people, will have no effect at all, given the scale of the budget available to the state. There's a separate question as to what happens if people did this en masse. So, you might think that getting on your loudhailer and encouraging people to do it en masse yields a result. In South Africa, there's a real life case that's very interesting. So, our government had put in a toll road in the province that we live in, and had done through illicit tendering process, which came out. And so citizens then said, we refuse to pay for these tolls. And they did en masse. And eventually the toll tax was removed. And so each person's private failure to pay the toll made no difference. But those that sort of ran campaigns to say this is a good tax protest were able to yield, the good result. Arguably, it made government more accountable in terms of future projects to avoid illicit behavior. And so you might think that encouraging people en masse is a really good thing to do. And some people will have, as you say, they're doing it because they don't want to pay the toll or they just want to spend the money on their family. Others will have more high-minded ideals. When we're doing the evaluation, though, the question is, should we just look at the outcome and set aside, people's private rationales or, the kind of boasty explanation that they have for their friends that really covers up selfish behavior? But I imagine, you're going to think that selfishness is not a terrible thing. People acting in their own self-interest is generally, quite good for everybody. And, maybe getting on your loudhailer, would be useful as well.
Yeah, no, I have no objection to that. In the same way when, if you want to, let's take a drug that's illegal, like methamphetamine. If you want to do methamphetamine because you love it, I think that's your right. Do meth. Like that's their government has no authority to tell you that you're not entitled to do meth. And then if you want to say, and I'm also doing meth to protest drug prohibition and the criminal justice system, sure, whatever. Like, good point, because it's like the criminal justice system is ridiculous. And if there was like a mass movement of people just like doing a bunch of meth as like in protest of like the criminal justice system and drug prohibition, and it like actually worked, and they were like, you know what, we're going to legalize meth, like, sure, that would be great. And I think kind of a similar thing sort of did happen with marijuana, where just people were so openly disobeying the law at such scale that people kind of gave up on it and then decided to reform the law anyhow. So if it can work and it's instrumental, then like, yeah, God be with you. I have no problem with that. The thing that I bristle at a little bit is that I think oftentimes in political philosophy, a lot of political philosophers are just trying to rig up some kind of high-minded justification for the thing that they wanted to do anyhow. And I see that so much, the kind of left critical market view, where people give nothing to the poor and do nothing to actually advance the material conditions of the people that they purport to care about, but they just like do something that's in their own self-interest and then rig up a justification of it on the back end. And so I try to be a little bit uh, cognizant of that when I see it happening among my friends in libertarianism as well, because you might be right, but also you should be a little bit aware of whether it's too convenient for you. Maybe you just love math, and like the high-minded criminal justice reform case came later, which like no hate, because it's fine to like math and the government doesn't have the authority to stop you, but like, let's just look ourselves in the mirror.
So that's very interesting, and we're going to have to get you back to talk about math. But one of the objections now could be, well, I was on board with you on the tax front, but does that now push me into this pigeonhole where I don't want government interference in a lot of things, not just taxes, but I don't want government regulating my drug use. I don't want government regulating my behavior in a lot of ways. Maybe it's the classic libertarian view that you hold, that I can swing my fist at you, but no further than your nose. So do all these views necessarily go together? Do they hang together? Do you have to be a free drug proponent if you also going to be against personal income tax, or do you think there is a conceptual divide?
So the case against taxes, one way to think about it is there are no enforceable duties of assistance. So just because a lot of people have a great need for some kind of benefit, that doesn't mean that I'm liable to be coerced into providing that benefit for them. And that does have very broad implications across the board, supporting a broadly libertarian view. So that's a thing I've defended throughout my work in a lot of places. But here are some examples. Conscription is wrong. So you can't conscript somebody to labor for a just cause, even if it is a just cause, even if you're right, because a person's not liable to be kidnapped by the government and forced to go to another country where they could kill or be killed just because it's a worthy or just cause. So that's why conscription's wrong. Similarly, abortion restrictions are wrong, because even if a fetus has moral status, even if it's a great thing to do to become a mother, which I think it is, you're not liable to be incarcerated or punished by the government because you don't want to use your body to gestate and create a life over 9 to 10 months. You can't be conscripted into motherhood, even if it's a great thing. That's why men shouldn't be required to pay child support. They shouldn't be conscripted into caring for children that they didn't have a choice of whether to bring into the world. They can't be conscripted into parenthood unless they're ready either. And taxes are also a form of conscription in this way, where the government is conscripting you for 1 to 2 days a week and forcing you to labor for the benefit of others without your consent. But you might deny that. You might think, you know what? I do think there are enforceable duties of assistance. I think if it's not that costly to you, you can be coerced into helping another person. And then the supplemental argument for that against taxation is, even if you think that, the way that taxes actually work are not effectively assisting people. They're not bringing the benefits. They're nowhere near the best way that you could possibly benefit a person. In some cases, they do a lot more harm than good, both by restricting overall productivity and the size of the economy, or by enacting violence on other people, like the foreign wars that the United States has had abroad, like the war in Iraq or whatever. So like that's like, you would never call that a form of assistance. And so even if you thought there were enforceable duties of assistance in principle that could justify some kind of taxation, you still shouldn't think that actual taxes are justified on those grounds.
Well, Jess, I want to thank you for being such a fabulous guest, and great ad for a future episode. We'd love to have you back on to talk about other libertarian issues.